a few minutes to talk to you about some of the reasons that we study philosophy of moral leadership. It sounds like a strange kind of a concept, but in many classes we study leadership theory, we study it from a social science perspective. And I think one of the things we're finding these days is that leadership theory from the social science perspective, without having solid philosophical grounding, has become problematic. Um, we see this in many different kinds of leadership theories. Transformational leadership theory back many, many years ago, when I was studying leadership theory, that was a problem. The problem actually lied in ethics. Came down to something simply put as how do you transform someone as a leader without coercion. That may be just a simple way to put it. Um, and then they came up with pseudo transformational leadership to try to deal with that problem. I've written papers on leadership as practice and democratic styles of leadership, collective styles of leadership generally. And when put to the test, they have contextual issues at least. So, for example, it sounds great to huddle a bunch of people around a table and have a discussion every time there's a challenge that comes along or that people disagree with. And getting insight from different leaders, from followers, certainly valid and I would say desirable in a lot of cases. But when you put it to a theory, it has to be universally contextual, I would say, in most cases. And there becomes problematic. Think about the democratic style of leadership when we try to put that to the test. Let's say crisis situation, doctor in an ER. Is he going to gather all the people around when somebody's in cardiac arrest? How about on the battlefield in combat? Is it good for the captain to huddle his lieutenants once the rounds start flying into the unit? Well, that's where those nice forms of leadership where everyone's involved and sort of wanting to hear the voices of everyone become problematic. Now, it's not that those leadership theories are flawed in the way that they can't be used. They're just something that they're not, I think. At least not presented the way that they ought to be. And it goes to why we study philosophy and ethics in the context of leadership. Throughout this course, you've looked at different readings. We had two that I gave you intentionally, and I don't know if they threw you off as in why would they be related to leadership philosophy. Well, I mean, let's take Phaedo. What is the major point in Phaedo? Well, it has something to do with dying and the thought of death. I mean, why would we consider that in the context of leadership? Heidegger's famous for saying something to the effect of people should spend more time in graveyards than doing other things. And his he says something like that, but his point is pretty simple. Maybe if you spend more of your time thinking about what's going to happen when you're not here, you might have a little more of the present. I think the same thing applies to leadership. Many times, and I'm sure you have seen this, where leaders are so short-sighted, um, they can only see right in front of their face. A lot of conflicting things going on within the context of the situation, the life of the leader, all these things. And I think one of the primary aspects of Phaedo is and his dialogue there between the, it's sort of a strange dialogue in the sense there's two of them, and then there's Socrates, and then that's passed down, and Plato finally writes it down. But I think one of the reasons he finds it so fascinating is because by bringing up this notion of philosophizing about death, it can help us live better. So there's that perspective. I think one of the other interesting perspectives might have to do with your interpretation of Euthyphro. Well, Euthyphro is essentially focused on what is just or justice. And Euthyphro comes to Socrates, and at the time, by the way, Socrates is on his way himself to be tried for corrupting the youth, and Euthyphro is about to go in and prosecute his own father for chaining one of his servants, and the servant dies, and Euthyphro thinks this is terrible, but the servant had killed another servant, and so he's bringing, in his mind, Euthyphro is bringing justice. His father didn't put this person on trial, and so maybe there's a due process aspect involved, but that's not really what Socrates is interested in. He's not interested in the court process. He's interested in understanding why Euthyphro wants to, or thinks that it's just to prosecute his father. And then he gets into piety. And I think one of the key things that you'll get out of Euthyphro is the concept of, I think Socrates asked the question something like, well, is it pious because the gods say it's pious, or is it pious because it's pious outside of what the gods say? And this is an argument that's used later against things like divine command theory and moral absolutes. It's sort of, with divine command theory, it's sort of like, well, did God create morals? Did God say what's right is right, and did he say it because he's God? Or does right stand somewhere outside of God? And it does create kind of a dilemma. Now there's a lot of good theological arguments I won't get into here, but the important point is, this concept of justice is not as easily grasped as we might think. Alistair McIntyre wrote the book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? And he says it right in the title. Whose justice are we speaking to? Often one person's justice is another person's injustice. And so just the notion of justice alone, just for who? Then the other thing we can think of when it comes to specifically Euthyphro and this concept of justice is, whose rationality are we using to justify our justice, right? It sounds circular, but if you think about it, in economics, they use certain ways of describing people or ideas as rational, and others are assumed to be not rational, right? If you watch the debate that I sent you, this is part of the fundamental challenges when you're talking about things like leadership. Atkins and Lennox debate about what science can and can't do, what explanation means. We use these words all the time. We use justice, we use piety, we use explanation. It's important to understand the limitations of those words because they're often used in context by clever people, and I think a lot of times it's done to fool other people that maybe aren't catching on to what they're actually saying. I often say that words mean stuff, and when you think about this, the debate between Atkins and Lennox, I don't think you walk away with, oh, Lennox wins or Atkins loses, or Atkins wins or Lennox loses. If you walk away with anything from the debate, it's that they come from incommensurate worldviews, incommensurate moral traditions. Anything that has to do with the notion of divine or God, Atkins immediately dismisses, but he dismisses it outright. And Lennox challenges him on that because he has, as you see in the video, Atkins has really no other explanation, and he's sort of okay with that. Only what science can prove is real, but he leaves a lot of void there. And I think Lennox does a good job of explaining how sometimes what I've come to call scientism has really become not only popular, but very challenging for people to deal with. Because on the one hand, you have people that are doing science. A lot of physicists have these days are questioning the limitations of physics and what they can prove. And I think Atkins sort of touches on this, where he says about mathematics, we can sort of prove things through mathematics, and Lennox is like, well, these things are never testable, so you can't really prove them. Mathematics is simply a language. We write in philosophy. It's a strange kind of a way to write. There's reasons that we write that way so that we can make clear, concise, logical arguments, and I think mathematics does a great job in assisting with that. But the fact that Atkins admits that some of these things will never be able to be proven, but he takes them sort of at face value just from the mathematics. So, he would defend an infinite number of universes instead of God simply because his start point is different. He cuts out right from the beginning that God can even exist. And so by doing that, he thinks he's protecting his science. Whereas Lennox is pointing out that by doing that, you're jeopardizing your science. That's sort of a lame way to put it, but I think that, in the end, that's what they're getting at. And so why is something like that relevant to leadership? Well, just look at the two of them in the debate and the way they handle their questions differently. There's so much you can learn from that video, that debate that they have, because on the one hand, you look at Lennox, he's relaxed. Atkins seems agitated. Different sort of personalities for sure. But I think in that you can almost see different styles of leadership. And a lot of people will talk about leadership and they use words that are hard to understand. People will use, well, he has the right personality. I don't know. I'm not even sure science can tell us what personality is. You should probably look that one up. It's interesting to try and delve into some of the things we assume that we know and we really don't. Personality theory is one of the other areas of inquiry that's under some great challenges right now. But just as an example, Atkins is leaning on certain words and trying to make a case, and you could argue that he does or he doesn't, but he's trying to make a case based on, can I see it, touch it, feel it, sense it? But at the same time, he leans on mathematics as sort of this fill in the gaps, which is interesting because that's sort of what he levies at Lennox. Lennox uses God to fill in the gaps. But I think at the end of the day, I want you to see that just that is an example, a worldview that begins with an assumption that there is a divine, holy God. There's sacred text. There's things like that, and then an atheist worldview coming from a completely different perspective. This is one of the things that we tend to lose in leadership theory. We just jump right into the theory, but we don't go back to the philosophy. A lot of social science is focused on intentions and behaviors. That's because those things are more easily researched and predicted, right? We can observe behaviors pretty clearly. We can assume intentions sometimes off of behaviors. So in psychology, they tend to stay more towards that behavioral aspect. Our program's called Ethics and Organizational Behavior. It really should be Ethics and Organizational Psychology, especially because we focus in our program, as you'll see, more on beliefs and attitudes, and less on intentions and behaviors. And we do that for a reason. It's because, that sort of Fishbein and Athens theory of planned behavior, beliefs lead to attitudinal formation. Attitudinal formation leads to intention, conation, and then we have behavioral manifestations. And so there's sort of a line of progression there. And I think, especially in universities generally, there's too much focus on the latter. There's too much focus on the latter side of that scale, the behavioral manifestations. And that's because we can sort of do social science, in the methodologies of social science allow us to have more empirical data when we're focused on behavioral manifestations, right? So in that sense, that's a great thing to look at. My contention is that there are too many psychologists and people who study behaviors, management people, practitioners, things like that. They have a tendency to go to the social sciences and study those behaviors, but they don't understand the underlying philosophies. And if you don't understand the underlying philosophies, I don't know how you can really interpret the data, much less provide an explanation. And I think that's part of the thing Lennox is getting at. You can't just say, okay, if it's something that we can see as tangible. I've watched this leader over and over again. Aristotle might say something like this: building character. You find a really good leader and you watch that leader over and over again, and you model out yourself after that leader. But then, of course, there's the fallibility of mankind, and the fact that leader, maybe that's Hitler we're following, and he seems like a great leader at first, but what happens? How do we know when he's not a good leader? How do we know when to differentiate that? And that falls much more in the realm of beliefs, because those beliefs should be led by our moral principles, right? And so as leaders, if we're not looking at beliefs and attitudes, going all the way back to what people's fundamental beliefs are, how can we really understand what leadership is, what it's supposed to look like, and what we're supposed to do as leaders, when many of us haven't even reflected ourselves on how our own belief systems, our moral principles, our own values impact our leadership? And I think that's one of the challenges of studying leadership generally, is that it becomes difficult to study without incorporating philosophy. And unfortunately, I think we've done a lot of that in the academic community. Leadership has been studied intensely from a very social science perspective. I think to bring it some legitimacy, something more like psychology that has a tendency to do the same thing. But I would contend that, a lot of those social sciences, including psychology and leadership theory, are currently struggling generally as disciplines, because they sort of forgot the first science, the first philosophy, the underlying principles of what they're trying to do in social science is grounded in something. And by putting that aside, we lose so much, and we may be completely off track. I often say about servant leadership, because it's a popular thing at Christian universities especially, but it's generally looked at as a good thing, and I think it is a good thing. If we refer to it as more of an ideology of leadership or a concept of leadership. But there's too many people out there that try to study servant leadership as a theory, as a theoretical construct, and that becomes very problematic. I've had many students that try to they take maybe a leadership course that's skewed more towards the theoretical orientation without understanding the philosophy behind it, and they try and use it in a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. And one of the problems with that is when you sort of get to the end, if you haven't ensured that your argument is philosophically sound, it can often fall apart. And so I think, why do we have courses in the philosophy of leadership instead of maybe something that you might get in another school that's focused on behaviors? Because all of our courses in the ethics organization currently called organizational behavior, the ethics and organizational behavior program should be focused on the philosophy of whatever you're studying, whether that be the philosophy of human development, whether that be the philosophy of leadership theory, whether that be the philosophy of moral leadership, all of these subjects that we touch. Think about change management. I mean, that could be taught in a lot of different ways. Our courses are designed to look more into the philosophy of change management, which does come back to the philosophy of leadership and the philosophy of moral leadership. Because what is a leader that's not a good leader? Good meaning a good person, right? Well, I remember hearing many times over my career in the military as, well, if you think you're in charge and you think you're a leader and you turn around and nobody's behind you, you're probably doing something wrong. So if you have no followers, I guess that's the point there. I would just suggest that by looking at leadership through the lens of dilemmas like Euthyphro presents, like is presented by Plato and Phaedo, that we discuss in the disengagement of moral self-sanctions and why people do those things. It kind of makes me sad that we don't study more philosophy of things before we delve right into them from more of a scientific perspective. I think that's purposefully been done. I mean, they first stripped theology out of the universities and then a lot of philosophy out of the universities. It's starting to come back because now we're not just talking about human leaders, we're talking about agents, AI agents, that are essentially acting in sort of leadership roles, providing advice, giving guidance, all these things. So it's getting very, very strange, and it's why I think a focus on philosophy and beliefs is so important. I'll leave this session with, if you are struggling to make that connection between the theory and the underlying philosophy, don't assume that it's all you, because there are a lot of psychologists, leadership theorists, social scientists generally that write on things that aren't very well versed in philosophy, not even the philosophy that underlies their own theories. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you look all the way back, like I said about Bass and Burns coming up with transformational leadership theory, and then it be questioned on the basis of its ethic, they either missed it outright or they didn't handle it correctly from a philosophical sense, in my opinion. And I think that a lot of people agree with that, and it's one of the reasons that some of these theories are struggling today. I hope this was helpful. If you that philosophical component, the ethics behind the theories that you're studying, please reach out and we'll have some discussions. Many of you already have, and a lot of times it's just a simple discussion with someone like Socrates, hence the Socratic method. He likes to ask questions, and you see that with me. I'll continue to ask you questions until we start to get to a place where you're starting to ask questions that aren't easily answered with facts, not facts that you can prove scientifically anyway. And I think that's one of the differences that we're trying to do, is we're trying to expand your thinking beyond the empirical, and to make arguments in a logical way, and that's why your methodology for the thesis in this program should be philosophical inquiry. I often allow my research students to do some expert interviews or something like that, but certainly for the master's level, it's not realistic to do a full-blown research project. But you should be able to put together a philosophically sound master's thesis with a good argument that leads other researchers then maybe to go on and look at maybe more on the behavioral manifestations, more on the empirical side of your argument later on as it goes forward. But you start off with that sound philosophical understanding, free of logical fallacies, and concise, to the point, using the right words, and knowing what those words mean. And so in your papers, when you're using words like justice, when you're using words like ethical as opposed to moral, when you're using words like Socrates is trying to discuss when he's talking about death and what that means to be a person and a human. Those are the kind of things we want you to bring into your arguments and your thesis. And if I can help you, reach out. I'm always here for you. And I hope you had a great week. And coming up the end of the term, not going to make it down to graduation this year, so I'll miss you guys. But I'm sure I'll see you soon. And if you need anything, reach out.